So now that we have an overview of the organs of the male reproductive system, let's start talking about some of the specifics. And we're going to start with the male gonad. So when we think of gonad, we know that that means it's capable of producing gametes. And in this particular case, when we're talking about the male, we're talking about sperm. So before we move on to the specifics, let's think about the homologous structure when we're talking about females. So what is going to be the paired sex gland that's going to produce gametes in females? That's going to be the ovaries. So these are very straightforward examples of a homologous structure between males and females. Okay, so we're going to have paired oval glands. These are going to be the testes. And one thing I want to point out, because I know you're going to be looking at the imagery here, is that in this particular portion right here, this is what we refer to as a hemisected portion of the organ. So we're actually looking at the internal structure of the testes, whereas here we're looking at the actual coverings of the entirety of the testes. So embryologically, testes are actually going to develop in the abdomen, very near the kidney, so fairly far up. So they have quite a ways to go in terms of the descent, which occurs around 7 months in utero. So what actually will happen is it's going to travel through this, the inguinal canal, which is about in that region. It will travel through there along with the contents of what we refer to as the spermatic cord, and in an adult individual it will be suspended there within the scrotum, which is associated with the skin that is going to hold the testes. So the two main functions of the testes is to produce sperm, so spermatogenesis occurs here, as well as the hormone testosterone. So it has two main functions in terms of the testes. Now, in terms of what's actually going to cover and protect the testes, we'll talk about the scrotum in a bit more detail in a moment, but there's two things that are going to be much more closely adhered to the testes. This is going to be your tunica vaginalis, which is going to be the more external or superficial, and the tunica albuginea, which will be very closely adhered to the testes itself. So this will be the more internal structure or deep. The tunica vaginalis is actually going to be a remnant of the peritoneum, and that makes sense if you think about the testes actually having developed within the abdomen, which obviously is going to have the associated peritoneum. That peritoneum is going to travel and descend with the testes through the inguinal canal and then form this covering here. And you actually have two different layers here. You have the visceral, which is very closely associated with the albuginea, and the parietal, which forms more of that protective role there. Now in this particular image here, you can kind of see it in this portion right here. So a little bit tougher than what you have in terms of the tunica albuginea. Now albuginea is going to stand for white, so basically a very dense white connective tissue, which gives it this appearance here. So very closely adhered to the actual structure of the testes. Now, one of the main functions, as we discussed, is going to be spermatogenesis, and this actually occurs within the testes and what we refer to as the seminiferous tubules. And we'll talk a little bit about the seminiferous tubules. They will actually kind of coalesce into what we refer to as the ductus deferens, which is one of the main ducts associated with the male reproductive system. But you're going to have about 300 million sperm being formed through spermatogenesis per day in a typical male. And sperm really is going to be composed of two parts. You're going to have the smaller but wider head. This is where the nucleus is going to be located with those 23 chromosomes. We refer to that as haploid. Also importantly associated with the head, you have what's referred to as the acrosome, which is going to release enzymes that can help in terms of being able to unite with those secondary oocytes, or the gamete portion in terms of the female. Now the tail is going to be the longer portion of the sperm. It's very important in terms of the mobility of sperm. You actually have mitochondria associated with the tail that will allow ATP production to occur. So that's the basics in terms of the testes. We'll talk a little bit more about that duct structure in terms of the ductus deferens as it goes through the spermatic cord. But first, let's talk about the sac by which the testes are going to be held, and that's referred to as the scrotum.